All right, so you've requested a deep dive into Nietzsche. And as a fellow philosopher, I know you're not here for just like a basic overview of his work.
Right, yeah, Nietzsche is definitely not an intro to philosophy 101 kind of thinker.
Exactly. So we've got excerpts from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on Nietzsche, and we're going to go deep, deep, deep.
Yeah, buckle up.
Okay, let's start with one of his most well-known and kind of infamous statements. God is dead. Now, obviously, he wasn't being literal here, right?
Right, not a theological claim.
But it gets to the heart of his critique of Western thought. For Nietzsche, this death of God wasn't just about religion.
No, not at all.
It was about the foundation of all values. So if God is dead, then what gives our lives meaning? What's stopping us from just descending into chaos?
Yeah, that's exactly the question he wants us to wrestle with. He saw the death of God as like a crisis, but also an opportunity. An
Yeah,
opportunity to like reevaluate our values, to create new meanings, to forge our own paths without relying on those traditional sources of authority.
which brings us to his critique of morality. It's not enough to just reject God. We need to examine the values that have grown up around this belief in God.
Exactly.
And this is where the concept of the slave revolt and morality comes in.
Yeah, absolutely. And on the genealogy of morality, Nietzsche argues that the values we usually associate with goodness, like humility, compassion, self-sacrifice,
Right, the things we typically think of as good.
right, those are actually products of this historical power struggle. He claims they arose from the resentment of the oppressed, the weak who resented the strength and vitality of the masters.
Hold on, resentment, that's a pretty loaded term. What did he actually mean by that?
Yeah, he's not talking about ordinary resentment, as Nietzsche uses it, as like a much deeper, more insidious hatred.
Hmm,
It's born out of powerlessness, like this feeling of impotence that just festers and turns inward, poisoning the soul.
wow.
And it's this resentment, he argues, that fuels the slave revolt, this revaluation of values where the weak define good as whatever they happen to be. Humble, powerless, meek. The masters, by contrast, they get labeled as evil simply because they embody strength, vitality, and a will to power.
So he's turning our conventional understanding of morality on its head.
Yeah,
He's suggesting that what we call dude might actually be a form of weakness disguised as virtue.
exactly. To understand how he gets to this radical perspective, I think it helps to consider Nietzsche's own personal journey. His early interest in philology, the study of language and historical texts that really influenced his whole approach to philosophy.
It's like he was dissecting ideas the way a philologist would analyze an ancient manuscript.
Yes, precisely. He was interested in uncovering the hidden meanings, the power dynamics, the psychological motivations that shape our beliefs and values.
And his break with Wagner, a major cultural figure at the time,
Huge, yeah.
really speaks volumes about his willingness to challenge established norms and authorities, even those he once admired.
Right. He doesn't shy away from challenging anyone.
And then there's the impact of his declining health. Nietzsche suffered terribly throughout his adult life. It's hard to imagine that his physical pain and mental anguish didn't influence his philosophical outlook, especially like his emphasis on strength and the will to power.
Yeah, I think it's highly likely that his struggles with illness contributed to that focus on resilience, on affirming life in the face of suffering.
Hmm.
He saw weakness, both physical and moral, as something to be overcome, something to be transcended.
So this brings us back to that critique of morality. He saw slave morality as promoting values that ultimately weaken the human spirit.
Yeah, leading to a kind of spiritual sickness almost.
And this ties directly into his critique of guilt, right?
Yes, Nietzsche traces the concept of guilt back to the idea of debt and punishment. He suggests that guilt, especially in its Christian form, becomes internalized and leads to those self-destructive tendencies. We become our own debtors and punishers, trapped in this cycle of self-inflicted suffering.
So instead of empowering us, this kind of guilt diminishes our capacity for growth and self-realization.
That's his argument. He saw guilt as a tool of social control, a way of keeping individuals subservient and preventing them from embracing their full potential. And this leads us to another key idea, asceticism.
This sense of guilt, this turning inward, it's like a form of self-imposed imprisonment.
Yeah, exactly. Like a spiritual prison almost.
And asceticism for Nietzsche, that's the ultimate expression of this, isn't it?
Precisely. He saw asceticism, this rigorous self-denial, the renunciation of worldly pleasures, as a manifestation of that deep-seated resentment we were talking about.
Right.
It's a way of punishing ourselves for simply existing, for having those desires and instincts that are considered sinful by the dictates of slave morality.
But I think as philosophers, we're also interested in what he proposes in place of the system he's critiquing.
Right, of course.
Does he offer any positive values, a way forward after the death of God and the dismantling of traditional morality?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it's one that's sparked endless debate among Nietzsche scholars. Some argue that he's primarily a critic, a master of demolition, but not of construction.
Okay.
But others point to specific values that emerge from his work that offer a glimpse into a possible Nietzschean ethics.
All right, let's delve into those values then. One that immediately comes to mind and seems to connect with his critique of asceticism is the will to power.
Ah, yes, the will to power, perhaps the most misunderstood and misappropriated concept in all of Nietzsche.
Hmm,
It's often reduced to just this crude desire for domination, for brute force.
right, just raw power over others.
Yeah, but Nietzsche's conception is far more subtle and complex than that.
So what is the will to power really about?
For Nietzsche, the will to power is a fundamental drive. It permeates all living things.
Okay.
It's the striving for growth, for overcoming resistance, for self-expansion and self-mastery. Think of it as a kind of creative force,
Okay.
an impulse to shape and mold yourself and the world according to your own unique vision.
So it's not just about power over others, but also power to create, to overcome your own limitations.
Exactly. It's about pushing boundaries, testing limits, constantly striving to become more than what you are. And this connects to his critique of Schopenhauer's pessimism,
Right.
which he saw as a kind of surrender to those forces of suffering and negativity.
Giving in.
Instead of resigning ourselves to a world of pain and meaninglessness, Nietzsche urges us to embrace the challenge, to strive for something greater, to create our own meaning through the exercise of our will to power.
This reminds me of another key Nietzschean value, the affirmation of life. We see this most clearly in the concept of amor fati, the love of fate.
Amor fati is a radical acceptance, a joyful embrace of everything that life throws at you, the good and the bad, the joys and the sorrows. It's not about passive resignation, but an active, passionate engagement with the totality of existence.
You know, this idea of embracing fate, it takes on a whole new dimension when you consider Nietzsche's own struggles with illness. He was constantly confronted with pain, with the fragility of life. And yet he still championed this idea of saying yes to life, even in the face of suffering.
That's what makes Nietzsche such a compelling figure. He doesn't just preach these ideas from an ivory tower. He embodies them in his own life and his own struggles.
Yeah.
And for Nietzsche, amor fati is the antidote to nihilism, the belief that life is inherently meaningless. He's saying that even if the universe has no inherent purpose, we can create meaning through our active engagement with life, through our embrace of all that it has to offer.
To live a life worthy of amor fati, to truly embrace one's fate, it seems like another crucial value is needed honesty, or as Nietzsche sometimes calls it, truthfulness.
Honesty for Nietzsche isn't just about stating facts or avoiding lies. It's about a deeper commitment to self-knowledge, to confronting even the uncomfortable truths about ourselves and the world. It's about tearing down the facades, the illusions, the comforting lies that we tell ourselves to avoid facing the often harsh realities of existence.
But isn't there a danger in this relentless pursuit of truth? Couldn't it lead to despair, to a kind of nihilistic disillusionment?
That's a valid concern, and Nietzsche was acutely aware of the potential dangers of truth-seeking. He understood that truth can be liberating, but it can also be unsettling, even destructive.
Right.
But he believed that ultimately the pursuit of truth is essential for self-discovery, for growth, for becoming who we are truly meant to be.
It seems like there's a tension here between this unflinching pursuit of truth and Nietzsche's emphasis on art and artistry. Art, after all, often relies on illusion, on creating beautiful appearances that may not reflect reality.
This raises a fascinating question about the relationship between truth and illusion. How can we reconcile Nietzsche's seemingly contradictory claims about the importance of both? Well, I think he saw art as a necessary counterbalance to the harshness of truth. Art provides a space for us to process the difficult truths we uncover, to find beauty and meaning in a world that can often feel cold and indifferent.
So it's like art gives us a way to cope with the weight of existence, to find solace and inspiration in the face of the abyss.
Precisely, art can be a source of healing, of transcendence, of a kind of Dionysian ecstasy that allows us to momentarily escape the constraints of our everyday lives and connect with something larger than ourselves.
And this connection to something larger, I think, leads us to another key Nietzschean theme, individuality and autonomy. He celebrates the free spirit, the individual who creates their own values and life on their own terms. He seems to be saying that each individual has the potential to become a kind of artist, shaping their own lives into a unique work of art.
That's a beautiful way to put it. And this idea of self-creation, of giving style to one's character, is central to Nietzsche's philosophy. But it's important to note that he's not advocating for just any kind of individuality. He's critical of the idea of universal human value. He believes that true individuality is earned through self-overcoming through a process of struggle and self-mastery.
It's like he's saying that some individuals are more valuable than others, not because of any inherent worth, but because of what they make of themselves, how they overcome their limitations and strive for excellence.
This is definitely one of the more controversial aspects of Nietzsche's thought, and it's something that we as philosophers need to grapple with, but it speaks to his emphasis on striving for something beyond mediocrity, on pushing the boundaries of human potential. And it's important to note that Nietzsche wasn't advocating for any particular social or political system. His focus was on individual flourishing, on each person becoming what they are capable of becoming.
This brings us back to Nietzsche's rejection of traditional systems of thought. He wasn't simply advocating for a different set of moral rules. He was challenging the very foundations of morality itself.
Exactly. He was questioning the idea of a single objective truth, a universal moral code that applies to everyone, and this is where his concept of perspectivism comes into play.
Perspectivism, so like the idea that there is no single objective truth,
Right.
but rather that there are multiple perspectives on reality.
Yeah, multiple perspective all kind of vying for our attention.
That's got to be a challenging concept for a lot of people, especially those who are seeking certainty.
It is, and even for us, as philosophers trained in this pursuit of truth and reason, perspectivism can be a bit disorienting.
Yeah.
Nietzsche challenges us to acknowledge those limitations of our own viewpoints and to embrace the inherent subjectivity of all knowledge.
But isn't there a danger in that? Doesn't that lead to relativism? Like the idea that all perspectives are equally valid?
That's a common misconception. Nietzsche wasn't arguing for a kind of anything-goes relativism. He recognized that some perspectives are more insightful,
Right.
more life-affirming, more conducive to human flourishing than others. He called for a revaluation of values, not an abandonment of values altogether.
So it's not about simply accepting everyone's perspective as equal,
Right.
but about examining our own perspectives and being open to the possibility that other ways of seeing the world might offer valuable insights.
Exactly. And this connects to Nietzsche's emphasis on pluralism, on the value of that diversity of thought and experience. It's interesting to think about how Nietzsche might have viewed our current social and political landscape,
Oh, yeah?
with its intense polarization and these echo chambers where people only engage with viewpoints that confirm their existing belief.
Yeah, I can't imagine he would have been a fan of that kind of intellectual conformity.
No, I don't think so. It seems to run counter to his entire philosophical project,
Right.
which is all about questioning assumptions, challenging conventions, and forging one's own path.
He'd probably be telling us to break out of those echo chambers to engage with people who hold different views.
Definitely, to embrace the discomfort and the challenge of encountering those perspectives that might force us to re-examine our own cherished beliefs.
This brings us to maybe the most challenging and enigmatic of Nietzsche's ideas, the eternal recurrence. The idea that everything that has happened will happen again and again infinitely. This one makes my head spin a little bit.
Yeah, it's a mind bender for sure.
Is it a scientific theory, a metaphysical claim, a psychological thought experiment? What are we to make of this?
The eternal recurrence is one of the most debated concepts in all of Nietzsche's scholarship. There's no single definitive interpretation. Some scholars see it as a cosmological hypothesis,
Okay.
others as a psychological test of our attitude towards life. I tend to think it's best understood as a thought experiment, a tool for self-reflection.
I like the analogy I've heard where it's like asking yourself, if you could live your life over again, would you make the same choices? Would you marry the same person?
Right.
It forces you to confront the weight of your decisions,
Absolutely.
to assess whether you're truly living a life that you value, a life that you would willingly repeat for all eternity.
That's a brilliant analogy. I think it gets at the heart of what Nietzsche's trying to do with the eternal recurrence. He's asking us to imagine a life without regret. A life lived with such intensity and authenticity that we would embrace every moment, even the painful ones, if given the chance to relive them.
So it's a call to live fully, to embrace our fate, to make choices that align with our deepest values, knowing that we might have to repeat those choices and their consequences for all eternity.
Exactly. It's a radical challenge, an invitation to live with a heightened sense of awareness and responsibility. And it highlights the importance of creating a life that is worthy of being lived again and again. Now, you might be thinking,
How do we even process this?
right, how do we wrap our minds around this? Well, I think that's where Nietzsche's unique writing style comes in. His work is full of aphorisms, paradoxes, dramatic shifts in voice.
Yeah, it's not exactly a straightforward read.
He's not trying to present a systematic linear argument. He's trying to shake us out of our complacency, to provoke us, to make us think differently.
It's like you're saying, don't just read my words, wrestle with them, argue with them, make them your own.
That's a great way to put it. And as philosophers, we're well equipped for this kind of intellectual wrestling match.
We've had some practice.
Our training in logic, critical thinking, textual analysis gives us the tools we need to engage with Nietzsche's complex and often contradictory ideas.
So where does this leave us? What does this all mean as we continue our own exploration of Nietzsche's thought?
Well, Nietzsche throws down a gauntlet. He asks us to question everything, to embrace uncertainty, to become creators of our own values and meanings. This deep dive has just scratched the surface. Now it's up to you to continue the exploration. What stands out to you? What questions does Nietzsche provoke? Consider this. How might Nietzsche's ideas be used to critique contemporary moral and political discourse? What hidden motivations might he uncover? How would he challenge our current values?
That's something to ponder, isn't it? And on that note, we'll wrap up our deep dive into Nietzsche. Thank you for joining us, and keep those philosophical wheels turning.